Welcome everybody to this podcast, which forms part of UCL Faculty of Laws bicentennial celebrations. Through a series of interviews, we are interviewing some of the most influential people who have shaped the faculty's development and success. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Sir Jeffrey Jowell KC, who has had and continues to have an illustrious academic and professional legal career. Jeffrey is one of the most prominent scholars of and practitioners of public law and public international law globally, with a legal practice at the bar spanning multiple jurisdictions, doing notable work on human rights, democracy and constitutionalism, including very influential work on the new South African constitution at that time in the 1990s. As an academic, he has published widely on constitutional and public law, held public office in multiple capacities, was inaugural director of the Bingham Centre for Rule of Law, and so on. But for today's purposes, Jeffrey held office as Dean of the Faculty of Laws at UCL for two key periods in the faculty's history. For around 8 years in the 1980s, from 1981 to 1989, and again for a 4-year period in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Both of these periods also as head of department. Jeffrey, thank you for joining me. You were a law student in South Africa in the 1960s and very involved in student politics. You were a postgraduate student in the US and the UK, again, quite involved in student politics. You had your first academic post in Canada, where you were finishing off your doctorate at Harvard with Lon Fuller. And then you came to the UK and you took up an academic post in public law at the LSE, pioneering areas of public law in that appointment, and then appointed, very impressively, Professor of Public Law in 1975 to UCL Faculty of Laws. How did you find the faculty when you arrived in 1975?
Well, in many ways, I was inspired by UCL when I first read the application. I didn't know much about it then. I knew it existed, but I didn't know about its history of UCL opening its doors to non-Anglicans, to all races and religions. And I was terribly impressed with that spirit. And the law faculty, I thought, had some very distinguished teachers. And it was in London, which could be a huge advantage. I was very attracted by that. Cultural centre, certainly in my field, of both law and government. There's a rare opportunity to draw on that if you're part of that institution. And then there were the students. And as opposed to other places at that time, like the LSE where I had been teaching, it had what were called student troubles and all sorts of tension between staff and students. I discovered by asking a number of students here and getting to know them that this was a very happy place in terms of staff-student relationship. It always has been. And that was really important to know because it allowed a certain development. On the negative side, and with that I only found after I became a member of this faculty, it was an autocracy. Lord Lloyd of Hampstead, a very distinguished man, introduced the Rent Acts, worked with his great friend Arnold Goodman, the great solicitor fixer to Harold Wilson, then Prime Minister, who was also a student and taught at UCL. But he ran it as pretty well on his own. I'll never forget when, shortly after I came, I asked whether we could have another lecturer. We could appoint a lecturer in public law, and I expected him to consult me, to ask me, where did the talent lie? Where should we advertise? Who might we appoint? Would I be on the board of appointment? But no. He announced to me one day, "I'm sure you'll like this person. Her name is Dawn Oliver." Then became dean here. I did like her. She was a marvelous appointment, but I had absolutely no say in her appointment, except he said, "I know you'd like her because she had been your research assistant." So that had to all be changed.
So many of the things you're reflecting on the culture and the ethos of the place still ring true today, which is, I think reassuring, particularly
Yes,
on
but not the autocracy.
Not the autocracy. We're going to talk about how that changes. I mean, what's amazing is within 6 years of being in the faculty, you were appointed head of department and dean. So that was in 1981. How did you become appointed to both of these roles?
Well, I said I would only become head of department if I could also be dean, because I wanted to be my own foreign minister. The dean dealt with the college, went to all the meetings with the provost and so on, where power lies, after all. Funds come from there and so on. And one had to spread the word about the faculty in other departments and work with them, because another attraction of UCL to me was it was a multi-faculty institution. That was very important. LSE was purely social sciences, and there was all sorts of opportunities there, I thought, possibly as well, in terms of public policy generally and working with other disciplines. So that's why I wanted to be dean as well as head of department.
And in that context, what was the faculty like at that point? And what were your priorities as dean and head of department for that first deanship period through the 1980s?
Multifarious priorities. The first was to build on the strengths of the institution. One of the strengths was the fact that it was there was quite a bit of interest in comparative law. We had students from all over the world, as I said. And there was, of course, Roman law. And there was Professor Butler taught Russian law. It was the only place, I think, almost in the whole country at that time that did that. Wow. And so we immediately went about altering the curriculum, which hadn't been changed for years. And one of the things we introduced there was that all students at some point had to take one comparative law subject. So we then introduced European community, later European Union law. We got a French person, Jacqueline Duté de la Rochère, who was living in London then, later became Dean of Paris Assas. And we expanded from that into other areas of comparative law. A few years later, I realized that the Japanese had been coming to UCL in the late 19th century. And so I took a chance, went to Japan. It turned out that those that came to UCL had become terribly distinguished, including the then Prime Minister of Meiji Japan when it opened up to the world. Wow. They gave us £1.5 million to create a chair of Japanese law in those days. And generally, if we couldn't find, and also, and so that was the first, comparative law, holding on to legal theory, because after all, the very first two teachers at the law faculty in the 19th century were Amos and Austin. Austin was a very famous legal theorist, and the Australian Salmond had come over here as well. And so there was a great move then to abandon all kind of legal theory that I thought was really important.
Was that move in the faculty or in the sector?
No, generally, I think people were a bit fed up with jurisprudence. They thought it wasn't a practical subject. I had the opposite view. I thought that this is students here plunging into a law degree. They ought to know something about society and also about the background of law, the principles that govern legal rules. It should not only be a sort of trade school and teaching people how to do conveyancing and so on. It was very much the ethos of the school at that time. So let's broaden it out. Let's keep legal theory. Let's bring people into the faculty who understand how theory and practice mesh. So we brought in two teachers at that time, in particular William Twining and Bob Heppel, who couldn't have anybody better. We started attracting people from other places as well. And this was also done through a certain amount of fundraising, which hadn't been done before. It was very controversial, by the way. I remember speaking to the dean of LSE at the time, and he said, are you a Thatcherite? I said, "Well, I'm not going to disclose my political views to you." "Why do you ask?" He said, "Because you seem very interested in the private sector." He said, "and universities don't fundraise. We entirely rely on the state for our resources." And but we found that fundraising wasn't that difficult, not the sort of razzmatazz fundraising that institutions tend to do these days, but trying to convince one or two people that they would be really helping us and giving something of value if they supported a chair in environmental law, commercial law, areas where we found it very difficult to attract people at that time.
So in the sense, you're both going back to the roots, the Austin and the jurisprudence and the connection with practice, but also blazing the trail for the future with things like fundraising that, whilst the state has always had a role in funding higher education, that has become something where supplementary funds are helpful in the current era. What challenges did you face? Because you mentioned that some of these things were controversial, curriculum reform, private sector. Were those the things that were challenging to both internally in the faculty, in the college, and externally, or were there other challenges that you met during your deanship?
I think the faculty, when I came, was probably ripe for change. And I think that's in some ways why I was brought in. The chair that was created after the departure of Dennis Holland, I took over his position, was very much described as one which had to do with law and social change and public law in its social and economic context, and involved also with other areas of public law. I taught planning law for a long time, and we worked together with areas in public administration. So it was both interdisciplinary, trying to be based more on principle, but also very practical.
So you then paused being dean, I think, to focus on more academic pursuits or work in legal practice, including the work on the South African Constitution.
Yes, we did that through the faculty. A number of such projects. We raised money to bring the South African drafters of the Constitution to Ditchley Park, where we assembled a large number of people from all over the world, experts from all over the world, many professors, but also others, practitioners, a couple from London, some judges, to assist with the drafting of the Bill of Rights part of that Constitution in particular. That was when we worked with the University of Cape Town and Professor Hugh Corder there, with whom I had worked, on the right to administrative justice, for example, which was a pioneering provision of the South African Constitution, the environmental rights, and a few others. I had a very small role in that, but UCL certainly did play its part in that.
Interesting that the administrative justice, administrative law, and environmental law have stayed very strong areas of study and research in the faculty, as well as the comparative law and kind of international legal study aspect of the Faculty of Laws that we have been since our inception. That is something that has lasted, and I think you both reinvigorated but developed a much bigger legacy around that international outlook of the faculty.
Yes, well, I think I'm very pleased to hear that, because I think that's what makes it so vibrant and interesting as a faculty, actually. And the other thing, of course, the two other points on that, is that we allowed the students the opportunity to take degrees abroad. And this started with Jackie Dyson, who was then sub-dean, and I, and she speaks fluent French. And I speak sort of French. I'll pretend I do. And we went to Paris, Aix-en-Provence, Germany,
Spain?
Italy and Spain, and set up these programs so that our normal 3-year students could study for 4 years and spend one of them in the middle in one of these countries. And then in my second term as dean, we extended that to Sydney in Australia and to Columbia in New York.
Remarkably, those programs remain the core of our international education partnerships. We've extended a little bit, but they apart from the Italy one, which has gone into abeyance, but all of them have built and are core planks of our international programs for our students.
Oh, I'm so pleased to hear that.
And we hope to do more.
And we also brought in students from elsewhere through the Erasmus program, of course.
Yes.
No longer.
Well, it's coming back.
Coming back. Oh, I'm very pleased to hear that as well. This is all good news today. And the other area, of course, we managed to get a few scholarships for South African students who were victims of apartheid, black students. They came over here for a number of years, and I think part of that program still exists.
We still
with
have
the Constitutional Court of South Africa.
Yes, which is a fantastic program.
I'm very pleased.
Yeah, and highly competitive, I should say.
Yeah, and the other thing, sorry to interrupt, but the other thing I think we tried to do was to draw on London and the resources, in particular, of law and the bar and solicitors, and bring them into the classroom.
And how did you go about doing that?
I started with Lord Brown Wilkinson, who became the senior law lord before it became the Supreme Court, and sort of was very attracted to academic matters, but had never had much of a chance to get involved in them. He was a very thoughtful judge. And he was then Vice-Chancellor, the head of the Chancery Division. And he agreed one day in a conversation with me to come in once or twice a month to give the Vice-Chancellor's lecture. So he did that for about 2 or 3 years, and always on a different subject. He was very versatile. And it was wonderful. We attracted, in addition to our normal program, current legal problems, a series of seminars, staff seminars that we set up where people could give papers, and those papers were published to try and up the research. We brought in practitioners, Anthony Lester, later Lord Lester, QC, was a human rights lawyer. I asked him to come in to teach public law students, not to distinguish one famous case of the Supreme Court from another, but rather to show what it's like when a problem comes to your desk, and you have to decide which way to go. Do I litigate at all? Do I settle? If I do litigate, then how do we do it? And then he would take them all the way up to what actually happened in that case, which would sometimes result in a case in the highest courts. And he'd have all these papers there and show the students how to do it. So there's that sort of connection. And these people were very kind. A number of practitioners came in different areas.
Wonderful
there
experience.
was Edward Walker Arnott, the leading company lawyer in this country, who came and actually taught a course on corporate something or other, and he's just written a book on that subject. And he taught our LLM students, I think it was, or was it third-year company law students, for many, many years, coming in from Herbert Smith Freehills, once a week, just giving of their time. Marvellous.
It is marvellous.
Wonderful resource that you have in London.
Agreed. And again, we are very, very lucky to have people like that who still contribute their time for our students today, which makes such a difference. You made a reference just then to upping the research kind of the faculty. And that's one thing that it does kind of strike as quite odd at this point, that research wouldn't be a core focus of the faculty. But what did that look like? Where did that drive come from you, for you as leader, and how did you go about inspiring staff to take research seriously?
I was very lucky that the first research assessment exercise took place, I think, halfway through my head deanship.
Yeah.
I took it. A lot of people didn't. A lot of deans didn't take it at all seriously because it sort of seemed a bit intrusive at the time. Can you please tell us what you've done in terms of research over the last so many years, and would you report all the publications that? Oh gosh, most of them
it's a lot of work.
Tore it up. Yeah, but I only thought, oh no, wait. Funding's going to probably come with this. And I think we ought to take this very seriously. So I spent a lot of time putting in it. And then I went around and I spoke to every member of the faculty. And then that became a routine. Each year you'd speak to everybody and say, how's the research? What can I do to make your life more productive in terms of research and other things. You're there, I think, as Dean, and you'll know this, to do your very best to create the conditions under which other people thrive. And that's, correct, I think, the way I saw my role. And I'm sure you do as well. And
very much so.
And so you raise funds to help with this. And one of the ways we did that was to really give the building over the summer, when there was nobody much there, to American universities. And sometimes during term time, or having a kind of an association. There was this one university in law school in upper state New York, which everyone was very snooty about. I thought was actually just as good as our faculty. And it had some excellent people in it. And they paid us to come and sit side by side with our students for a few weeks and gave us a huge amount of money. At the end, I'd spent every penny that college had given us in our normal, departmental allowance. I was greatly criticized for that when my successor took over. He said, and I think he announced to the faculty, Jeffrey spent every penny that we were given from college. But what he didn't say was that side by side to that, there was a 200,000 kitty in which we got money from Georgetown University when they came in the summer and others who used our premises at that time. And from there, we set up a research fund to which members of the faculty could apply.
During this first deanship, the faculty also grew quite significantly. Where did you find room to put everybody, Jeffrey?
Well, that did become a problem. So there was a building next door. I'm the son of a businessman who didn't go into the family business. And all sons of such businessmen, first thing they want to do if they become a dean is to buy the building next door. So I went to see Hillel House, who were next door, and they were very inclined to sell the place, but it had to be negotiated, and there wasn't the money available. But Mr. Bernard Schreier gave us the money. We didn't have enough at that point to take the whole building over. We took over the top half and then drilled into it. So immediately we got 2 or 3 floors in the top half of what we then called Bentham House and with the Schreier wing in honor of his son, who had sadly died very young. So that's how we got our hands on the first part of the building. And then I left office and went to see them again and said, asked them if they'd be inclined to sell the second half, and handed that over to Hazel to negotiate, which she did very well.
She did. And to this day, we have the Gideon Schreier Lecture Theatre in the renovated building, which connects the old building and the new building in a really beautiful way, which completed in 2017.
Yes. And
you were involved also in the renaming of Bentham House.
Yes, it was called Thorn House after a trade union leader, because it was a former trade union building. Very high quality Art Deco building, wonderful building. Beautiful. In many respects. And we decided, not all of us agreed with Bentham's principles of utilitarianism, but nevertheless he was a great thinker and reformer of his time and a founder of UCL. So Bentham House it was. And we took a lot of trouble, I should say on that point, that we took a lot of trouble with the quality of life within Bentham House. It's good for students, it's good for staff. We created staff common rooms, improved the student common room, had lunch places and so on, all terribly important about day-to-day living, isn't it?
Indeed. You were welcomed back and tempted back for a second period as dean in the late 1990s.
Yes.
What lured you back, and what were the highlights of your second period as dean?
I wasn't really lured back. It was for want of an alternative. I was I was part of the interviewing panel. The provost and I and 1 or 2 others, Derek Roberts at the time was the provost, interviewed for a successor, I think, to Dawn Oliver. Correct. At that point. Yeah. And nobody seemed to be quite ready, let's put it that way. partly because they were involved in so much research and stuff themselves that they didn't want to do, or they didn't want to do it, or they said we'd do it part-time. Nobody was enthusiastic. And I thought, I don't want to be vice provost forever.
Which is what you were at that point.
I was at that time, as vice provost here in the college. So I said, well, why didn't I do it? But I only did it for 2 or 3 years. I did for 3 years at the end. And that was an interesting time because I'd done it before. I sort of knew the ropes. Things, of course, changed. They always change. There were different issues. But I was very lucky because I could attract some outstanding teachers. At that point, people were willing to come to us from Oxford and Cambridge. We were always sort of looking over our shoulder at those institutions. Now they were beginning to sort of say, hey, this is an interesting place to be. And I still think that the best appointment, I made some marvelous appointments, not to disparage anybody else, but he was an extraordinary person, was Ronald Dworkin. He mesmerized so many people in the faculty that there was at the end there was sort of division between the Dworkinites and the created a certain amount of tension.
That may or may not still exist, Jeffrey.
I'm sure it always will with Dworkin because not everybody agrees with him. He was a marvelous presence.
Yes.
And he left Oxford, where he always shared the chair of jurisprudence at Oxford with New York University.
Yes.
And so he kept his New York role for 6 months and then would come here for the second half of the academic year. And anybody who attended these lectures would just know that they were complete magic. And he was wonderful to have around, and he stimulated everyone. He spoke to everybody about their work. It was great. And then we had Basil Marcasinus, much more difficult person to handle, but absolutely brilliant. Brought with him a whole global law institute. So in my second term, we not only had the students going abroad, all these links with other places, activities going on, like working on the South African Administrative Justice Act, bringing some of their best lawyers over here in the faculty, and having visiting professors from all over the world. But we had this Global Law Institute where Marcasinus suddenly brought in these wonderful scholars from, Europe proper, working side by side with us. He was hilarious because he was so wonderfully, wonderfully ambitious, which I always encouraged, until such time as he said, I think you promised me all the floor that you're on, plus your own office. At which I objected, and he said, well, I'm going to object to the provost and complain about this. And he did, and he eventually left. He often left institutions because he was a wonderful character. And that was one of the most difficult management issues of my time.
I mean, so many hallmarks of the current faculty are the seeds that you planted during that time. The level of ambition, the intellectual breadth, the internationalization, the links with practice. And I think the faculty for that owes you a great debt of gratitude, Jeffrey.
And I owe the faculty gratitude for allowing me to do things. It was just a huge privilege, actually.
One of the controversies during your second period as dean was a suggestion, I believe, about changing the governance of the faculty at the UCL level. Would you like to tell me a little bit about that time?
Oh yes, there was a new provost. Llewellyn Smith was his name, Christopher Llewellyn Smith, very distinguished physicist, and for some reason, I don't think he liked law very much.
Oh dear.
And he decided that we should really be in a larger faculty that included some social sciences, philosophy, and a few others. And we thought that was a terrible idea, partly because we had a huge amount of funds which we knew would be redistributed to those poorer faculties as much as we would like to help them. And we, by the way, we always worked with them. He announced to the what is it called? The academic board.
Yes.
He announced to the academic board that I had agreed with his proposal.
It's quite a
which
move.
I simply had not. So I sort of rather weakly said, I don't think I did agree, Provost. And he said, oh, yes, you did. So we were on the warpath, but we asked him into the faculty and tried to persuade him why it wasn't a good idea, because law schools all over the world are single faculty institutions, because they have a professional role. They appeal to their own alumni who have a professional role, see them as, their donors all see them as a distinct law faculty. Their donors wouldn't come near a humanities faculty for good or ill. And we're also part of great law schools all over the world, name them, Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, New York, wherever they are. They're all standalone law schools. And the matter was put to academic board, and Ronald Dworkin in particular, who was a professor at NYU as well, said, I can assure you, he said, I know that this law school will diminish in status if it's put into other faculties. We are interdisciplinary, we're not against that. And we had a tremendously uphill battle, but eventually we won the vote in academic board. Christopher Llewellyn-Smith was terribly weakened by that, and particularly by the fact that it was known, and I didn't press the point, that he had sort of double-crossed me in that meeting that I described. And shortly after that, he was removed from office.
A big moment in the history of the faculty.
We didn't want that at all, but that's what happened.
Looking back, what would you say, if it's possible, you were most proud of during your time as dean? And do you have any wisdom you might offer the faculty for its future?
Well, I have no wisdom except this, that I've mentioned practice in London. And when I came, one of the things I should have said when I first came over is that there were a number of the staff, when I came over, the teaching staff, who were really practitioners, who were sort of given a few extra pounds by coming in the evening to teach at UCL. It was that kind of law school. There were others who were absolutely wonderful and full-time academics, but there were too many of them at the time. So there's that problem, and I think we got rid of that problem by early retirements and bringing in many more full-time, proper intellectuals.
Really expanding the faculty.
Yeah, and very much expanding it. But at the same time, I think it's very useful to know what's going on in the practical world of law, because it is a practical discipline. It's also a theoretical one. It's also a socio-legal one. It's all those things. And I see it now that I'm practicing full-time, that people want UCL students because they are sort of rounded and they do everything, but also because they have that edge of having been tutored by people who have got their feet in practice in London. But it's a very difficult line to draw. I always thought that I should, and we made a rule that you just never cancel a lecture in order to be in court, which restricts what you can do. And also as an academic who practices, and I was one of them, you only take briefs in the area that you specialize in. Otherwise you get attracted by other area. You have to do too much outside of the faculty and research.
All of these things are the balance of getting the balance of everything right continue to be the things we do look at.
Yeah, but the other bit of wisdom is that, if it is wisdom, is that one must, this faculty should always set its sights very high, because it's far too often I hear people saying, Oxford and Cambridge are the only two institutions in this country that where you can really rely on the quality. Well, that's simply not true.
We know that's not true.
Well, we know that, but we've got to guard against that, keep up that kind of confidence, which is based in total reality.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for your time and sharing all of your thoughts and perspectives and history and wisdom with me today.
thank you, Eloise, and thank you for carrying on this job. It's you're doing extremely well.
A privilege, as you say. Thank you.